There was a stretch of American television, right around the turn of the millennium, when a show about White House staffers arguing over policy memos was somehow the most binge-worthy thing on the air. That show was The West Wing, Aaron Sorkin's NBC drama that ran from 1999 to 2006, followed the fictional administration of President Josiah Jed Bartlet, and walked away with 26 Emmy Awards along the way. You know the cast. Martin Sheen as Bartlett, Rob Lowe as speechwriter Sam Seaborn, Allison Janney as Press Secretary C.J. Craig, John Spencer as Chief of Staff Leo McGarry, Bradley Whitford as Deputy Chief of Staff Josh Lyman, Richard Schiff as Communications Director Toby Ziegler, and Janelle Maloney as Donna Moss, an assistant who was never supposed to become one of the show's most important characters. Today we're digging into 15 facts about the West Wing that even the most devoted fans might not know. Contract fights that nearly erased major characters, a real cigarette break that ended in a death, a piece of 19th century presidential history that made its way onto primetime television almost unchanged, and one actor whose off-screen life lined up with his character in a way that became almost too painful to watch. Stick around, because number one is the story of an actor and a character who, by the end, weren't really two different people anymore. When Aaron Sorkin first pitched The West Wing, President Bartlet wasn't supposed to be the center of anything. Sorkin's original plan leaned almost entirely on the staff, the speechwriters, the strategists, the press office, with the president himself kept mostly off camera, a looming presence the staff reacted to rather than a character the audience got to know. Martin Sheen's own deal reflected that thinking. As Sheen later explained it, "When I did the pilot, my contract was for just 3 years, and it was confined to maybe 3 or 4 episodes every season." He wasn't hired as a lead. He was hired as a recurring supporting player who'd pop in a handful of times a year. That didn't last. Sheen's single big scene in the pilot, Bartlet's now famous entrance, quoting the First Commandment to a room full of religious broadcasters, reportedly convinced Sorkin on the spot that burying this character in the background would be a mistake. NBC and Sorkin tore up the original plan, and Bartlet went from a bit part to the emotional and moral anchor of the entire series for the next 7 seasons. It's one of the more remarkable pivots in television casting history, a show almost built around a president who was barely supposed to be in it. Donna Moss, Josh Lyman's assistant, and eventually one of the show's most beloved characters, began life as a footnote. According to accounts from the production, the character was originally written as a small, one-off guest role, a minor staffer meant to appear briefly and then disappear. What changed things was chemistry. Once Janelle Maloney and Bradley Whitford started playing off each other in the pilot, the rapid-fire, will-they-won't-they energy between Josh and Donna was too good to abandon. Sorkin kept finding reasons to bring her back, scene by scene, episode by episode, until a guest part quietly hardened into a real character. By the time the show reached its later seasons, Donna wasn't just comic relief. She was running her own storylines, holding her own with the West Wing senior staff, and eventually working for the vice president. Not bad for a character who was written as a name and exit. If you watch Season 2 live, you remember exactly where you were for 18th and Potomac. Mrs. Landingham, Bartlet's fiercely loyal secretary, played by Catherine Hewson, is killed by a drunk driver just as the president's hidden multiple sclerosis is about to become public. It's one of the most devastating hours the show ever produced, and it fed directly into 2 cathedrals, an episode still regularly ranked among the best in television history. What most viewers never knew is how casually the decision got made. Sorkin has said the idea came to him at a charity dinner, during a cigarette break with Hewson. She mentioned, in passing, that she'd been offered an audition for a regular role on another pilot and might have to scale back her time on the show. "I really stopped listening to everything else she was saying after that," Sorkin later told the West Wing Weekly podcast, "and just began thinking, how would I write Mrs. Landingham off the show?" By the time they'd finished their cigarettes, he'd more or less decided her fate. The kicker, that other pilot reportedly never went anywhere. Hewson's death on the show ended up being unnecessary from a career standpoint, though she landed on her feet regardless, later winning 2 Emmys as the nosy neighbor on Desperate Housewives. The joke that apparently circulated on set afterward, "Never take a smoke break with Aaron Sorkin." Every long-running drama has one scene fans can't stop talking about. For The West Wing, it's C.J. Craig cutting loose to the Jackal in a room full of exhausted staffers, the buttoned-up press secretary suddenly lip-syncing and playing air guitar like she's the only person in the building not having a bad day. The scene wasn't invented in a writer's room. It came from something Allison Janney and Richard Schiff were already doing between takes, just to kill time on long shooting days. One night we were being completely silly, Janney recalled to Empire magazine, describing how she'd practice lip-syncing songs with Schiff playing along as her imaginary backup. Sorkin wandered into Janney's trailer around midnight, found her mid-performance with Schiff smoking a cigar and playing air drums beside her, and, by his own account, said only, "We're doing this," before going back to his office to write the scene into the next script. There's an odd twist to how it was filmed, too. Janney's first take was, by her own admission, too polished. She was performing as herself, fully committed and note-perfect. Sorkin had her dial it back and play it more like an amateur enjoying herself than a trained performer nailing a routine, because the whole point was that CJ was a stressed-out professional blowing off steam, not auditioning for a talent show. President Bartlett had a habit. He'd grab his suit jacket by the collar, swing it up and over his head, and let both arms drop into the sleeves at once, all in one clean, decisive motion. It read as a little bit of directorial flair, a visual shorthand for a man who moved fast and thought faster. It wasn't a performance choice at all. According to Sheen's own account and multiple biographical sources, his left arm was injured by forceps during a difficult birth in 1940, a condition known as Erb's palsy that left the arm several inches shorter than his right, with permanently limited range of motion. Threading a jacket on conventionally, one sleeve at a time, was never comfortable for him. So decades earlier he developed his own workaround. Grab the collar, flip it overhead, and let both arms land in the sleeves together. You can spot the same motion in his earlier films, including Badlands Back in 1973. By the time he became President Bartlett, it had been his method for putting on a jacket for most of his life. The show didn't create the gesture, it just gave it a stage. Rob Lowe left The West Wing partway through season 4, and the reasons behind that exit reportedly ran deeper than the official amicable departure language suggested at the time. When the show launched in 1999, Sam Seaborn was originally conceived as something close to the audience's entry point into the White House, arguably the character built to carry the most weight. As the series developed, though, it became a true ensemble piece, with Bartlett, C.J., Josh, and Toby all pulling focus and racking up Emmy nominations. By the time contracts came up for renewal, that shift reportedly mattered a great deal. Lowe had signed on at roughly $70,000 per episode, among the highest-paid members of the original cast, by season 3, according to reporting from outlets including Entertainment Weekly and Hello magazine. Most of his co-stars had negotiated their pay up to match or exceed his, while Lowe's own request for a raise was reportedly told to wait. Sheen's own fee, meanwhile, had climbed sharply as his role expanded. Lowe has since been candid about how it felt. Decades later, on the Podcrush podcast, he described the experience as a super unhealthy relationship and said he'd felt very undervalued during his run on the show, comparing it to walking away from the most popular girl at school, but called that walk away the best thing I ever did. At the time, his official statement was far more diplomatic, saying only that it has been increasingly clear, for quite a while, that there was no longer a place for Sam Seaborn on the West Wing. Either way, his departure sent season 4 into a genuine narrative rebuild. Joshua Malinas Will Bailey stepped in to take over as communications director for the remainder of the series, and a storyline about Bartlett grooming Sam for a future in elected office quietly evaporated. That political torch eventually passed, instead to a different character introduced years later, Congressman Matt Santos. It's a rare case of real-world contract friction visibly reshaping years of a show's future plot, not just a single season. If you've seen even one episode of The West Wing, you know the rhythm. 2 or 3 staffers moving fast down a hallway, overlapping dialogue, someone else falling in beside them mid-sentence, the whole thing threading through doorways and around corners without ever cutting away. It's become one of the most imitated camera techniques in television, and it grew directly out of director Thomas Schlamm's own time observing the real West Wing before the show existed. What struck Schlamm wasn't the big meetings or speeches, it was the in-between moments. Staffers moving with purpose through hallways, even when nothing dramatic was actually happening. Because in that building even ordering lunch felt urgent. He wanted the camera to capture that same sense of perpetual motion and stakes, and the technique required enormous coordination. A Steadicam operator walking backward through the set, while actors hit precise marks and traded pages of dialogue without a single cut, often passing the baton of the scene from one pair of characters to another mid-stride. It became so central to the show's identity that the West Wing walk and talk is now a recognized term in film and television production circles, taught as a technique in its own right. The West Wing felt suspiciously authentic for a fictional drama, and that wasn't an accident. According to reporting in The Hollywood Reporter and Mental Floss, Sorkin brought on a rotating group of consultants and staff writers who had actually worked in and around real presidential administrations. D.D. Myers, who served as press secretary under President Clinton, is widely credited as a major influence on C.J. Craig's character. Marlon Fitzwater, who held the same job under George H.W. Bush, was brought on partly to make sure the show didn't tilt too far in one political direction, a deliberate effort to keep both major parties represented in the writer's thinking, even in a show whose fictional administration was unmistakably Democratic. Gene Sperling, a chief economic advisor to both Clinton and later Obama, and speechwriter Peggy Noonan, known for her work under Reagan, also contributed. On staff full-time were Patrick Cadell, a veteran Democratic campaign pollster, and Lawrence O'Donnell, a former senior aide to Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who became one of the show's most prolific writers, and who even appeared on screen as Bartlett's father in flashback scenes in Two Cathedrals. These weren't just script consultants brought in to check facts after the fact. They fed real institutional memory directly into storylines about legislative horse trading, White House turf wars, and the unglamorous mechanics of actually running a government. The kind of granular, insider detail that no amount of outside research could easily replicate. It's a big part of why even the show's smaller touches, like staffers grumbling about their Secret Service code names or the choreography of a last-minute speech rewrite, tended to ring true to people who'd actually worked in government. One of the show's stranger traditions, a day when senior staff are forced to take meetings with fringe advocacy groups nobody in Washington wants to see. Sounds like classic Sorkin whimsy. It's actually rooted in a real, and considerably stranger, event from the Andrew Jackson administration. In 1835, according to accounts documented by the White House Historical Association and the National Archives, a New York dairy farmer named Colonel Thomas S. Meacham sent President Jackson an enormous wheel of cheddar cheese, roughly 1,400 pounds, about 4 feet across and 2 feet thick. Jackson had it placed in the White House entrance hall, where it sat aging for roughly 2 years. In February 1837, near the end of his presidency, Jackson finally threw open the doors and invited the public in to help themselves. A crowd reportedly devoured the entire wheel in about 2 hours, leaving behind a smell that, according to some accounts, lingered in the building well into his successor's term. The show's version reimagines this as an annual, civic-minded open-door policy rather than a one-time free-for-all. But the connection was real enough that the Obama White House later revived Big Block of Cheese Day as an actual online public Q&A event, a nod both to Jackson's original stunt and to the show that had reintroduced it to modern audiences. For a show that would go on to define an era of prestige television, The West Wing had a genuinely rocky path to getting made. Sorkin's dialogue, fast, dense, layered with overlapping policy argument, was considered a tough sell to a network nervous about anything that smelled like homework rather than entertainment. Washington-set dramas didn't have a strong track record of connecting with mainstream audiences, and the show built around earnest public servants who actually believed in government felt, to some executives, like a hard pitch in an era of increasing cynicism about Washington. What ultimately tipped the scales wasn't creative conviction so much as demographics. When the pilot tested with audiences, it skewed toward exactly the upscale, educated viewership that advertisers pay a premium to reach, turning what had looked like a liability, all that too smart dialogue, into a selling point instead. NBC picked it up, and within its first season The West Wing was already being talked about as one of the most acclaimed new dramas on television, eventually sweeping the Outstanding Drama Series Emmy for 4 consecutive years. It's a reminder that some of the most acclaimed television of the era got made at all almost by accident of market research, rather than any executive's grand creative vision. Before there was a West Wing, there was The American President, Sorkin's 1995 romantic drama, starring Michael Douglas as a widowed president juggling the job and a new relationship. The film did well, but Sorkin reportedly felt he'd left an entire world half-explored. Story threads he never used, characters and corners of the White House that barely made it into the final cut. The push to turn that leftover material into a series reportedly came from producer John Wells, riding high off ER's success, who approached Sorkin about doing television, a medium Sorkin, by his own account, hadn't seriously considered. The idea that ultimately hooked him, suggested by his friend and fellow screenwriter Akiva Goldsman, was simple. What if the show followed the president's staff instead of the president himself? That reframing became the seed of The West Wing. Some of the unused story ideas from The American President found new life in the series, and pieces of the movie's White House sets were reportedly repurposed for the show. Leftovers that, in the end, helped produce 7 seasons and 26 Emmy Awards. The biggest early threat to The West Wing wasn't network hesitation. It was the real White House. Sorkin was finishing the pilot script in 1998, right as the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal consumed the news cycle. As Sorkin later put it at an ATX TV festival reunion, I typed fade out on the pilot, and a few minutes later, Monica Lewinsky happened. For months afterward, Washington was shorthand for scandal and dysfunction rather than public service, making a sincere, idealistic drama about people who believed in government a much harder sell. The pilot was effectively shelved for the better part of a year while the story played out. During that gap, Sorkin and director Thomas Schlam made Sports Night for ABC, a faster, funnier half-hour that let them test drive the overlapping dialogue and walking camera style they'd eventually bring to The West Wing. By the time NBC's drama finally went into production, the creative team wasn't experimenting for the first time on a big-budget pilot. They'd already worked out the show's signature rhythm on a smaller stage. There's a reason The West Wing sounds unlike almost anything else on television, and it comes down to sheer authorial control. Across the show's first 4 seasons, Sorkin wrote or co-wrote the overwhelming majority of episodes himself, a workload that reportedly contributed to his eventual departure from the series after season 4, when John Wells took over as showrunner. That level of control extended to the dialogue itself. Sorkin scripts are built on precise rhythm and cadence. The meter of a line often does as much work as its content, which meant that changing even small pieces of wording could throw off the intended musicality of a scene. The result is a writing voice distinctive enough that longtime fans can often identify a Sorkin-penned episode within the first few lines, purely from the pacing of the dialogue rather than its subject matter. It's part of why the show's tone shifted so noticeably once Sorkin was no longer writing every script himself in its final 3 seasons. Blink and you'll miss it. Buried in grainy home movie footage used in a season 4 flashback, the young version of Jed Bartlett goofing around with his kids is played by Emilio Estevez, Martin Sheen's actual son, appearing uncredited. It's a genuine blink and you missed it Easter egg. Most viewers scrolled right past it without realizing a real Sheen was playing a young Sheen. For the family, it wasn't even a new trick. Estevez had played a younger version of a Sheen character in earlier film work, so slipping into the role of a young Bartlett was a familiar bit of family shorthand rather than a novelty. It's the kind of quiet detail a show only gets to plant after several years of trust with its audience. A real father and son pairing hidden inside footage most people were never meant to look at twice. Sometimes a role fits an actor so precisely that the line between performer and character starts to blur. For John Spencer and Leo McGarry, it dissolved almost completely, and by the end, painfully so. Spencer felt the connection from early on. Like Leo, he was a recovering alcoholic who had gotten sober years before joining the show. By 1989, according to multiple interviews he gave during the show's run, and he spoke openly about how much that experience informed his performance. Like Leo, I've always been a workaholic too. he told the Associated Press in 2000. "Through good times and bad, acting has been my escape, my joy, my nourishment." Then the parallels turned genuinely eerie. In Season 6, the writers gave Leo a near-fatal heart attack, forcing him to step down as chief of staff, before he eventually returned as a vice presidential running mate. At the time, it read as just another obstacle for a beloved